The earth turtles emerged from the great flood of the first world. In the second world, the earth is alive in the magical voices and ceremonial words of birds and the healing energies of plants.
And for a while, life was good. But, as the old stories tell us, things changed. Sometimes for the better, but oftentimes not. Human population grew, people began to move around. The environment and all its creatures felt the strain as new technologies came along to reshape lives, our world, in ways that now threaten all life. In time for the first Earth Day in 1970, a business consortium was founded to shape public opinion, and it created the Keep America Beautiful campaign that resurrected an old romantic stereotype of an Indian eco-warrior to popularize its message, visualized by the Italian-American actor Iron Eyes Cody, who became the Crying Indian.
People start pollution. People can stop it.
The 1970s also gave us air and water quality standards, the Endangered Species Act, and the Environmental Protection Agency. However, the 70s saw other momentous issues that distracted Americans' time and attention away from the value of a sustainable environment. Protests against a long, protracted war in Vietnam and against racism and sexism were daily news headlines. The economy was in chaos while the presidency unraveled amid scandal and impeachment proceedings, which ultimately resulted in the president resigning. Nonetheless, calls for a healthy environment grew more forceful and urgent after toxic waste caused cancer and other long-term illnesses in a place called Love Canal, a housing development in Niagara Falls, followed by a partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. While the environmental movement grew, Native American writers, artists, and activists continued to share their own visions of how to value and preserve life on our planet. Through their work, they presented alternative views of humankind's place in the world, concepts that have evolved in North America since time immemorial. Born into the Crane clan of the Anishinaabe Nation, Vizenor spent his early years in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the White Earth Reservation nearby, where his father's family lives and where his grandmother, Alice Ballou, told him stories of stolen souls, the evil gambler, and evil spirits who eat human flesh in the city. He enlisted in the army and was sent to Japan as the Korean War ended. His time in Japan had a profound effect that continues today. And after his discharge, he took a Japanese literature course at the University of Minnesota, where he wrote haiku, a poetic form he sees as similar to native songs. And this inspired his earliest publications. He worked in many jobs over the years, as a reporter for the Minneapolis Tribune, a social worker, and as a human rights activist on the streets of Minneapolis, where he often held office in a bandbox diner to be close to the Native American neighborhoods he served. He took a teaching position at Lake Forest College in Illinois, where he found a forum for reaching generations of student readers. As his literary reputation grew, he accepted positions at several universities over the years. Over a long and critically acclaimed career, he has published numerous articles, essays, screenplays, and over 40 poetry and essay collections, novels, critical studies, anthologies, and recently, a series of historical novels based on Anishinaabe relatives who fought in France in World War I, one of whom was killed. Vizenor retired from the University of California, Berkeley, and continues to write, publish, and lecture. Over the decades, his audience grew as more readers discovered his imaginative world made of words, where they found a playful reevaluation of their senses of history, self, environment, a revisioning of all things, all through the power of language and his distinctive writing style.
Whatever appears to be fictional, or let's say visionary, or even fantastic, is always firmly connected to very recognizable monuments, places, names, events, situations. But I've always done that. From the earliest books, I felt as I developed my style that I would be able to create these wonderful people that I wanted to create with great visionary presence who had a lot of influence or were comical, or in other words, kind of trickster characters. And to do that and to try to play out this, urgency I have to move from oral storying somehow into print, into a book, so that it's forever. And it can't be done. It can't be done. But I can run a parallel play by different maneuvers. I can do a play. And one of them is to create a familiar landscape and then make it visionary. You can't distort the environment in a way that is unrecognizable, because that's what it has to hold.
The origins of that parallel play can be found in Vizenor's first published novel, written in the midst of a major national energy crisis in the 1970s. It began as Cedar Fair Circus, but became Darkness in St. Louis Bearheart, a story of a horrific, post-apocalyptic America.
The country was running out of gas. Big problems in the Middle East, Arab oil. But I was driving to California. Robert and I were driving to California, and the news broke that there were fuel shortages all over the country, and came into Los Angeles, and every station had a 2-block line. I thought about a country that runs out of oil and no longer has a social structure, that it's all dependent upon oil. So that was the start of it. I wrote the book primarily in a mansion on Summit Avenue, in a very unusual place, which has its own mystery and ghosts and elusive presence. Bizarre dreams in that building than I've ever had in my life. Maybe it was the spirit of the novel.
His sensitivity to understanding the ecological crisis that we're in today, and whether it's his fiction or nonfiction, poetry, there's always a sensitivity to the environment and understanding how out of balance we are today with toxicity and reliance on external energy and political dependency on places far away to ship in our oil or gas or food, and what would it mean to be self-reliant and self-sufficient again as a people.
Why we need to protect the environment is all over Vizenor, right? Not necessarily straightforwardly, but it is like the significance of it. It's like where a lot of our understanding of how to be in the world comes from. And so when we have like OPEC and all the oil, gas wars and all of that, and look ahead and see what could happen to our sacred places, for example. I mean, that's where Bearheart begins, in the sacred place, in the cedar forest, and then then it makes sense that a lot of the focus of other things are still connected to this kind of crazy, wild, weird, challenging novel.
But getting back to that narrative of apocalypse and environmental degradation, that was what was mind-blowing to me, to read a book that was written in the late 70s that is talking about things that are extremely relevant now. There's a passage that struck me. When the values of material possessions were useless without petroleum, when all the motors and gears stopped, when the coin returns no longer returned, there were no common values to bind people together and hold down their needs for violence and the experience of death. Death was too simple then.
Or it's scarily prescient, I guess. And the funny thing is, of course, he was indicting the world back then, you know? He wasn't meaning to talk about today. But the really strong works kind of, their paranoia often turns out not to be paranoia, you know? And that's terrifying, I think.
The third world turns evil with contempt for living and fear of death. Solemn figures are slashed open on the faces of tribal dream drums.
The war is won, others take its place, the gas runs out, and the government comes to the Cedar Fair Nation to harvest its sacred cedar for firewood in the cities.
Proud Cedar Fair determines his thoughts from morning dreams and moves through the trees and whispers. 7 clown crows crow in gentle spurts at his walking in the horizontal flight, fastened step over step through the first light. The last old man of the Cedar Nation stops at the tender center of the Meja Sand Ridge, which parts the sensuous mouth of the Mississippi River from the lake like a mythic smile.
From the headwaters of the Mississippi, that last old man, proud Cedar Fair, and his wife Rosina flee their sacred forest and begin a quest, a pilgrimage that snakes through the heartland of America on a route that is a parody of Western expansion over pathways such as the Santa Fe Trail. It ends in the ancient ruins of Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, at Pueblo Bonito, a city built over 1,000 years before Europeans arrived in North America. They travel through a shattered country, gone mad.
And I speculated at the time about whether there was a culture left that could survive the absence of gasoline, and my judgment was no, which I wrote to characterize what would happen in a multiple fascist state, where people are defending, in the absence of gasoline, what little they have, and they do it in small fascist groups, and there's a lot of violence.
Like in Bearheart, going from place to place, it's not, although you could put it on a map, it's maybe a line, but really it's a series of concentric circles where the characters are often working through the same problems over and over again. And what do we do when that happens? You get the rhythm of it. Just like that's Vizenor, right? All of his novels. There's a point where it clicks.
The first stop on their journey is a sanctuary of women, a large rural boarding house on the fictional Red Cedar Indian Reservation. The house has been turned into an ecosystem of plants and animals, all of which, including kittens, feed and sustain the collective.
Of course, today there's a great investment in gender equality and recognizing different sorts of gender orientations. Well, guess what? In the 1970s, it was all there in Bearheart. Vizenor was so much about the crossover between genders, the blending of genders, and so on. And so that at the time was revolutionary.
Battered by life and society, some of the women have terminal cancer caused by chemicals in processed meats, or scars and welts from accidents, or illness causing baldness and difficulty walking, but who, Sister Eternal Flame tells us, no longer need the cash and carries, the power and energies of the outside world. Gender equality, species interdependence, a viable ecosystem where life-sustaining resources are recycled, the Scape House gives readers a brief, although incomplete, glimpse, in Vizenor's terms, a tease, of values and perspectives found in tribal stories.
This kind of language that emerges from oral stories is not passive, and that the metaphors are alive, and they are not reductive to satisfy the idea of monotheism, that animals are separate from humans.
This hierarchy, which rigidly frames our thinking about other species, extends to all aspects of the living world and determines human interactions with our environment.
Vizenor was very prophetic in the 70s and 80s, when the writing was already on the wall about climate change and what was coming down the pike. And of course, our indigenous ancestors would say the writing was on the wall hundreds of years ago, even before the Industrial Revolution, with the colonial cannibalistic mindset of greed and sucking everything from the earth and not giving anything back.
When they continue their journey, Proud and Rosina are joined by another dog, Pure Gumption. Much like today, when dogs are used to smell disease and viruses in humans, Pure Gumption is the prototype of a therapy dog, a natural healer. She is a mongrel, and in Vizenor's writings, this means an imaginative hybrid who is adaptive and therefore a survivor. Mongrels, crossbloods, run throughout his books. From the Scape House, the pilgrims travel down the Mississippi to St. Paul, where they are joined by others and given a semi-truck that still has gasoline.
Sun Bear Sun pulled the shift lever into gear and moved out of the tunnel and through the weeds like a howling reptilian ghost. He turned right down the hill and crossed the Mississippi River on the new federal bridge. The mercenaries waved them on. There was enough precious national gasoline in the truck to drive to What Cheer, Iowa. Sun Bear Sun turned the truck and trailer toward the main road, entering the town, and rumbled down the wide boulevard past abandoned automatic laundries, new and used car dealerships, dead service stations faced with weeds and wild trees. Near the edge of the town, across from several deserted fast food restaurants, there appeared the large sign of the Evil Gambler. He was the monarch of gasoline, and the only way you could get some is to bet your life on it. And one of the characters almost lost, but outwitted him, and then I could bring in trickster stories and outwitting and irony. And
You know what's also striking about Bearheart? It's really a story about evil, right? The evil gambler. Gamble for the gasoline. And Lilith loses. And Proud Cedarfarer wins. But what's the basis? A wooden bowl with figures that represent the four directions?
The irony is based in a modern American compulsion for fast gratification through an economics of chance, timing, and sudden affluence. But in the novel, that old world dream is dead, so petroleum becomes a drug to reclaim its illusion, if only momentarily, in a car. Ironically, the evil gambler's victims are drawn to evil, trying to escape it, by wagering their lives for something that has no intrinsic value. 5 gallons of gasoline that can take them nowhere. They can't drink it. They can only burn it to get to a place with similar terrors. This is the illusion of self-centered liberty Staples exploits to defeat them, tipping the tenuous balance between good and evil his way when competitors suddenly recognize their vulnerability and, accepting the victim role, forfeit their lives. Staples learned his evil lessons at an early age, and his life story reads like headlines in newspapers today. One of 13 children, a woman truck driver kidnapped over years as she drove the country's highways, they formed her family, always in motion in her semi's trailer, which became both home and school. And he graduated a serial killer, obsessed with death, as he explains to Proud.
Have you noticed, little stranger, that there are no insects around here? Not an insect in the entire trailer monument. Mother hated the creeping and crawling of insects. Was forever spraying the truck trailer and dipping our clothes in insect poison. Dear Mother, she poisoned us all, but she did kill what she wanted to kill.
Humans are not the boss. Again, getting back to our traditional stories, humans were made last. We're fully dependent on the animals, the birds, the winds, the insects, the mushrooms, every little creepy crawly thing, all this tree. We are so dependent on this for our breath, for our life.
Glyphosate will appear on a list of potentially cancerous chemicals. The chemicals produced by Monsanto, which has filed an appeal after losing in court to prevent the labeling, arguing that the label will harm the company's business.
And as in Rachel Carson's 1962 expose of the poisonous effects of the insecticide DDT in her book Silent Spring, the roots of deadly obsessions are cultural.
The government and private business, the business bigger than government, started this indifference toward death with their pollution, industrial poisons. Thousands of people have died the slow death from disfiguring cancers because the government failed to protect the public. Death comes without knowing or seeing evil, as slow, unnoticed death.
When the time comes for Proud to face the evil gambler, one of the pilgrims first tells a story about a hunter who outwits an evil monster by teasing its vanity and overconfident lust for power. Sensing that Proud is different from his other challengers, Staples demands complete privacy for their play.
Your game is not a simple game of death. You would change minds and histories and reverse the unusual control of evil power.
Proud plays for life, to counterbalance evil with good, and not for dominance or personal power. Consequently, he does not fear defeat or death, and when they play, Staples smells of chemicals, oil, but Proud smells only cedar, cottonwood, willow. Overconfident in his self-proclaimed power, Staples takes his last toss as Proud makes a teasing whistle on the wind, and Staples' wood game pieces tumble. To illustrate the authority of life over evil games, Proud makes 7 straight successful plays, each leaving his pieces standing in perfect balance before ending the lesson. Good is an ordeal. Evil is not. Staples' illusion of dominance gone, he hurls a final insult at the departing pilgrims.
There is no gasoline. Your own selfish needs have brought you here. You are all still losers.
As the pilgrims leave, the gambler dies a slow, agonizing death by one of his own means, ironically with a way to save himself just out of reach. The pilgrims continue toward Santa Fe on foot along America's highways, where the full, horrific, crushing effects of the long-term failure of a society based upon short-term economic gain confront them head-on.
Fat black flies of summer bounded and buzzed against the heads and faces of the circus pilgrims. The interstate was crowded with families and small groups of people. Some pulled the last of their precious properties in wagons and carts. Beasts of burden lasted less than a few hours on the interstates. Roving mobs of survivor hunters killed animals for food. When violent women chased Private Jones in pure gumption for dinner, the circus animals were carried in disguises. The fear of cannibalism caused the interstate walkers to sleep close together for common protection. The interstate medians were strewn with discarded furniture and memorabilia the walkers could no longer harness or cumber. From the ruins of personal properties, some walkers stopped walking to live in wicky-up shelves and berths, tilted together and covered with flapping plastic or swatches of carpet. So I wrote in one chapter about the horrors of chemical poisons and how cancers and disfigurations, and my characters going north to south, going to Santa Fe, come in contact with a community of people who have fashioned plastic faces in place of their rotted and cancerous skin. It's a really horror scene of chemical poisons, and our culture hasn't changed that much.
It's more about a culture that uses and throws away. Yeah, he does everything he can to destabilize that, I think, and not just destabilize it, but upend it.
But human disfigurement isn't always physical. It can be psychological, and psychology, behavior, can be manipulated. And behavior, in turn, shapes our environment.
In Vizenor in general, and in Bearheart in particular, there's a lot of attention to language, to word. And of course, one of his famous phrases is about word wars. So power over the word does mean power over culture. And so therefore, Vizenor's idea of word wars is very important. Use of language is an exchange, almost like a monetary exchange, right? It becomes a consumed element of our culture as opposed to this kind of liberated notion of language that Vizenor holds tight to.
The pilgrims come to a hospital, the word wards, which are suggestive as George Orwell's novel 1984, in which language is weaponized to control behavior. The hospital is a government pilot project to decipher and study what the staff calls the public damage to language, which supposedly has led to a disintegration of social order. This was often a perception and call to action for those who saw the social movements of the 1960s and 70s as a sign of a deterioration of American values and traditions. The word hospital's technicians use computers to find a way to achieve social control by analyzing words used by what they term radical organizations and terrorists. And the staff has turned over several thousands of lines of free verse to intelligence organizations. Of course, in Vizenor's world, literature is resistance to control and manipulation.
The Genesis Communications Radio Network proudly presents The Alex Jones Show, because there's a war on for your mind.
In the final scene, the word hospital staff demonstrates a machine that directs individuals' thoughts and actions with electrical stimulation. This short-circuits their speech and self-awareness by igniting emotions of anger, hate, lust. This ongoing historical manipulation of language to control public opinion and to incite emotional, sometimes violent action is also a way to justify governmental policies. Vizenor's response is to co-opt the process to create a new word world that lays bare society's addiction to the illusion of privileged human ownership of the planet.
Took me, a few years to work out, by reading Camus and others, to, work out this idea of engaged literature. Literary people are always faulted for being passive. They aren't, of course, and I never have been. Romain Rolland developed this idea of engaged literature. It's a form of resistance and a form of action.
Engaged literature entices readers into new perspectives, challenges static beliefs, motivates imaginative exploration, much like native oral stories. Stories that change with participation, grow, and evolve. In opposition to these are stories, ideas, words, opinions that are fixed, inflexible and immobile, that don't grow and evolve. Cultural dead ends.
Talking about ward hospitals for 60 years, something like that. And probably the most dramatic scene that I've put together is the ward hospital in Bearheart. But it still is a serious discussion about terminal creeds, because it's actually gotten worse. And now the ward hospitals that I wrote about in Bearheart have actually become centers of learning. I mean, it's as if a terminal belief, or a terminal creed, as I refer to it, is somehow acceptable, and it forms the basis of knowledge. My idea is that people have actually taken up ideologies for the purposes of being terminal. That's it. This is our tradition. This is the word, and nothing more. Traditions can also be terminal creeds, because the idea of traditions, as it's exchanged mostly among people, is something very secure, stable, and it's like liturgy. It doesn't change. My idea, of course, is that it has to change. If it doesn't change, there's no culture. If it doesn't change, there's no life. The word loses its meaning. It has no metaphorical authority if it turns into a terminal creed. It has no creative power. It's terminal. And native stories, even creation stories, and sometimes this is difficult for students to understand, is a constant creation. And what I mean by that is that every storier creates a story that is in fact the creation itself. And that's sometimes difficult to understand because of the burden of monotheism, that there's one kind of central truth about a monotheistic belief. And that's put us in a lot of trouble with interpreting our relationships to animals and the environment.
And Bearheart is a unique visionary creation that lives today in its eerie foreshadowing of recent events. For instance, the pilgrims stop at the town of Orion, which is enclosed within a gigantic wall, completely cut off from the outside world. Its people never change, but they invite diverse refugees inside for dinner, during which they probe their opinions, only to mock them. While the word ward weaponizes the deeper emotional effect of language, Orion subverts rational discussion of ideas and beliefs through an act of dismissal. And then they poison their guests.
Move the banks and you change the stream. Tricks to change how everything seems.
A few years after the publication of Bearheart, Vizenor wrote a screenplay that deals with word wars and terminal creeds again. Unlike the tragic vision of the novel, Herald of Orange is a trickster comedy. The story of Harold and his Warriors of Orange, who take a group of white charitable foundation board members on a ride through a series of lessons that, in true trickster fashion, collapse walls of class and privilege by pulling the board's terminal creeds into the light with wordplay. Harold calls these a red pinch.
I have considered the origin theories of the American Indian. Some of them are really quite interesting. I find the Bering Strait migration theory to be the most credible. Well, how about you then? What are your thoughts?
Which way?
Which way? What do you mean?
Which way across the Bering Strait? East or west?
Oh, I see. Well, I never thought about it that way. Which way do you think?
From here to there, we were here first. We are the original people. Unless you think we are cousins to the panda bear.
Not at all. Not at all. Actually, what you say makes a great deal of sense. The problem I seem to have, you see, is that there's so little evidence to support your idea.
Jesus Christ was an American Indian.
Was he now? Who would have guessed?
I was... Hello? I was reading an article about Indian populations in the National Geographic magazine.
In the doctor's office?
No, we have a subscription. The article mentions revisions of population estimates of American Indians at the time of Columbus.
Who?
Columbus. Christopher Columbus, who discovered the New World? Well, actually, it was just an island. How many Indians were there then? I mean, here on this continent?
None.
None? What do you mean, none?
None, not one. Columbus never discovered anything. But when he never did, he invented us as Indians because we never heard the word before he dropped by accident.
Of course, I see what you mean. Let me rephrase the question. How many tribal people were there here when Columbus invented India?
49,723,196 on this continent, including what is now Mexico.
Well, I see. That many.
This is how battles in the word war are won. To dismantle a language of division and hierarchy, you identify the terminal creeds embedded in it. You create or manipulate words, ideas, gestures. You construct a parallel play that twists and turns until the people using it find themselves in an ideological crisis. What Vizenor terms socio-acupuncture, a curative trickster treatment for society.
When colonial language came into play, it wanted to leech the life from other beings in the world, and it created a sort of hierarchical structure in which humans were divorced from all other elements of the natural world, right? And there were these various kinds of ways that language draws divisions between things. And then if you, in your understanding, through the vehicle of language, determine that something like a river or a tree, etc., is not alive or does not have the same rights as humans do, then it becomes perfectly acceptable to destroy, to take the wealth from those beings.
In the final section of the novel, those pilgrims who survive make it to Santa Fe, and then the Pueblos. In Santa Fe, the harsh Spanish occupation imposed after the Pueblo Rebellion of 1680 and its modern versions are resurrected by an army of American militia who adopt the names of governors from its colonial past, trying to recapture their sense of racial privilege and power. Briefly held prisoner in the Palace of Governors, Proud, Rosina, and a few others escaped to the Pueblos where lifeways have survived, surrounded by those who would destroy them. From the Pueblos, they finally arrive in Chaco Canyon, the ancient site of a civilization that lived and thrived for eons by maintaining the delicate, tenuous balance of its fragile ecology. Here, they reach the end of their transformative quest.
When the old men were inhaling the dawn and laughing during the first winter solstice sunrise, proud Cedar Fair and Inawa Bawide flew with the vision bears from the window on the perfect light into the fourth world. In the fourth world, evil spirits are outwitted in the secret languages of animals and birds. Bears and crows choose the new singers.
Good is an ordeal, evil is not. The anxieties and evil spirits that gave birth to Bearheart in the 1970s are still with us, and their origins have not changed. belief in a privileged hierarchy that devalues many humans, but also animals, plants, water, all the life-sustaining fabric of a viable, diverse environment. But, as with the evil gambler, old stories show us they can be outwitted. Perhaps the animals will choose the new leaders of society, which is an element of the visionary spirit of Bearheart.
Maybe it was the spirit of the novel. I mean, I was loosening things because obviously the novel came out of me, out of my misery of the kind of environment we live in. And I have to go on living in it because I'm not going to give up.
Even the most common environmental problems that we're facing, oil, resource extraction, even litter, pollution, what does the individual human think? There's nothing I can really do. It's such a vast and huge, massive problem. That kind of sense that global warming has already happened. We can't stop it. And so then we're defeated, and then we decide, well, I'm not even going to try.
The sense of defeat people sometimes feel when overwhelmed can become a way of life, as Vizenor experienced early on in his social work on the streets of Minneapolis in the 1970s.
It was my first strong articulation against victimry. Almost everyone who came to me with some need, health, poverty, abuse, had adopted a language of victimry, not a language of, I'm going to make this work for myself. And that was difficult to deal with, and I had to spontaneously deal with it. And sometimes I would get angry for people because they were talking themselves down to be victims rather than claiming a presence and a place, and not pride and all that stuff, but a kind of personal courage no matter what the obstacles are.
Personal courage is an act of will, an ordeal made easier in a culture that supports it, instead of a culture that encourages simply giving up, which is a true terminal creed. Given the magnitude of social and environmental problems today, and the seemingly inescapable and unyielding powers that have created them, perhaps Vizenor's liberating works provide a blueprint through engaged literature, linked with wit and humor, that reveal the limitations of a sense of victimry by satirizing the hierarchy of human primacy, as in Herald of Orange, where the board members are transported on a school bus to experiences that upset their narrow attitudes, with the help of Trickster Harold and his warriors who, as one of his red pinches, teases us with, of all things, a popular board game that idealizes easy prosperity.
The foundations and the founders of the new world.
And a few fakes and fools.
You think we have to eat these?
Who will be the first to bear their name?
Name ceremony? Harold, wait a minute.
Kingman Newton. The urban spirits have directed me in a dream to select your name from the cigar box.
Are you serious?
Who can be serious about anything in a parking lot? Use your imagination.
You are a test.
Your new name is Baltic.
Baltic?
Baltic is your new urban dream name. Congratulations! All right, who will be our next contestant? Who will find fortune with a new name? Hey, step right into an urban dream, right over here. All right. The great urban shaman who directs the interstates has given me your name in a dream.
That better be good.
Your name is Connecticut. Congratulations. All right.
In the evil gambler's game, balance is a way to survive. In Monopoly, domination through bankrupting opponents is the goal, with one player left standing and in possession of the money and property. It's a hostile takeover, with the winner claiming the prize of place and all its resources while others are losers. A tragic psychology of competition that is not for self-enlightenment or for the benefit of the community, but for self-enrichment by taking from others, making them victims a dead-end terminal creed that threatens everyone's survival in the face of the mounting changes we see around us today, a time when new ways of thinking and being are needed to face the challenges ahead.
I think he asks us in many ways to simply re-see the world around us, right? And then, gives us tools with which to look at it, evaluate it, think about it in new ways.
He's given us a language. He's given us an avenue, a vehicle for saying, no, I'm not going to play your victim. I'm not going to play that victim role for you.
But as most of my readers know, this has been a strong and consistent theme of my work, to write against and resist with an ethos of Native identity against victimry. To do that, to live out this victimry, which some people still do, including some novelists, still play this game of victimry because there is an audience for it. And it has to end.
Those who hold power require subjects who do the work and consume the products, who accept society as it is and believe themselves powerless to change things for the better without risking their own survival. A terminal creed of inevitability created by images in a narrative of loss generated by word hospitals. Fortunately, other authors today, particularly some Native authors and filmmakers, have joined Vizenor's resistance against a language of victimry, feeling his sense of urgency.
And my literature has been part of that, especially my strong articulation and ethos of survivance, not victimry. And what is survivance? It's motion and presence and resistance. And it's not just survival, it's an once, it's a condition, it's a way to think about yourself and a community in spite of all the burdens and problems.
Once one has developed an once, a life view with its belief in agency, we can face the odds with personal courage and purpose, even if we are trying to influence people who do not see things as we do. If need be, we can become tricksters.
One is still not certain how your pinch beans are able to survive the winter.
Hey, were you in the war?
The Great War?
Yes, the Great Wars. You remember those little packets of instant coffee?
Not with pleasure, to be sure.
Yeah, well, we supplied the first instant coffee to the Great War, pinched from woodland beans.
Indeed. But are we ever going to see a real live bush?
The difference is in the telling.
Explain, please.
Well, logical positivist would need cold, clear data to make sure.
Watch.
Mythical trickster, on the other hand, be satisfied with a handful of beans.
Trickster stories, of course, confront terminal creeds, and that may be, in fact, why they're so popular with natives. I mean, we need someone who can create a new story, and one that we're slightly familiar with, but a good story picks up on the gossip of the moment, kind of fits it into an actual creation, and so everyone is part of it.
Such a creative visionary process, formed in Bearheart, is found throughout his later work, such as the novel Shrouds of White Earth.
Shrouds of White Earth, I think, was right at the start of the best I've done in this range, and I created a character whose name was Douglas Roy Beaulieu, a really sensitive artist. My artists, Doug Roy, take this subject up. In the first person, he says, I create traces of totemic creatures and paint visionary characters in magical flight. Native scenes in the bright colors of survivance. Brilliant artist, isn't he? The bright colors of survivance. My kind of artist.
being able to self-govern ourselves. Those are all critical ways that we can deeply and truly live sustainably again. And not that we become Native American, but we can learn how to be native to place so that we can live more sustainably and resiliently so that we will all enjoy survivance and endurance over the long haul of multi-generations.
The socio-acupuncture needed to heal our society and world may be found in visionary thinkers, mongrel writers and artists who, like Dogroy, create engaged art that remythologizes our world to inspire a revaluing of its natural complex networks, who can show a way to survivance with its way of thinking and being, who can be creative storyers for us all, even if their work is not always commercial or palatable to all readers, a wall Gerald Vizenor has faced from the very beginning, without flinching.
A few weeks after Bearheart was published, a friend of mine who was teaching at a community college had assigned the book without reading it. And when it came time to discuss it with the class, and of course when she started to read it, she called me in a panic and said, "I can't teach this book. The students will kill me. It's just too much. You've got to come to class." And I said, "Listen, I'm the writer. I don't explain the book. I mean, that's your job as a teacher." And she said, "But Jerry, we've been friends. Why didn't you tell me this is the kind of book it was?" And I said, "What, you mean sex and violence?" She said, "Yes, it's just too complicated for my students." And I said, "All right. As a friend, I'll just come answer questions. I'm not gonna defend or define or explain the book." So I went to class, and truth is, about 10 feet from the classroom, I could feel the heat coming out of there. It was a group of about 30 students. At least 2/3 were Native women, and they were maybe 3-4 years older because they had either left college when they first started or out of high school, were married and did other things, and then decided to return as students. And here they are reading Bearheart, and it's a small amphitheater, and they were really fierce, ready to be fierce. And I asked them if they would just calm down for a minute and let me say just one thing, and then they could have at me. Any question, and I'll discuss it. But I won't explain things. I'll just discuss my interests in writing it. So I asked them directly and calmly, "Is there anything in this novel that you haven't already read partly in a daily newspaper?" That took the heat out of the room when they realized that, of course, all I have done in my writing is to write about the things that people don't want to talk about. And then an older Native woman in the back row asked me in a very gentle voice, "Did I know John English?" And I said, "I know his name, but I don't know him personally." And she said, "He's an old man, and he's been telling stories like yours forever."